If you've been watching the headlines this week, you might think something dramatic just happened. You've probably seen phrases like Supreme Court blocks Trump tariffs, 6-3 ruling, and even a $175 billion tariff blow. Then almost immediately afterwards came another headline announcing a brand new 10% global tariff. On the surface, it looks chaotic, it looks reactive, and it looks like policy confusion. But underneath the noise, this is not really a tariff story, it's a power story. And if you understand what just shifted, you'll understand why global markets, and crypto in particular, are quietly paying attention. Before we go deeper, if you're new here, welcome. I'm Paula. On this channel, we break down macro, geopolitics, and crypto in a way that connects the dots without hype, without tribalism, and without emotional predictions. The goal is simple: to leave you feeling more informed than when you clicked on the video. And on a quick side note, if you enjoy this deeper kind of macro conversation, I also co-host the UK Crypto Podcast with Milkshake Matty. New episodes drop every Friday at 7 p.m. right here on YouTube and on Spotify. We really unpack the bigger narrative shaping the crypto week to week. It's a slightly different vibe, more conversational, but still focused on connecting macro to markets. So if you haven't checked that out yet, make sure you do. I'll link it at the end of this video. Now, let's unpack what actually happened. The ruling came from the Supreme Court of the United States in a 6-3 decision. The court ruled that tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, commonly referred to as IEEPA, were not legally permitted in the way they were used. IEEPA was passed in 1977 and was designed to allow a president to act during a declared national emergency. It covers things like sanctions, freezing foreign assets, and restricting certain financial transactions. What it does not clearly authorise is the imposition of broad-based tariffs. And this is the constitutional crux of the issue. Tariffs are legally considered a tax. Under the United States Constitution, the authority to impose taxes belongs to Congress. So the Supreme Court position was not that tariffs themselves are illegal, but that emergency powers cannot be stretched beyond their statutory language to impose sweeping import taxes unless Congress has clearly and explicitly granted that authority. In other words, this ruling narrows executive powers. It reinforces separation of powers. It pushes trade taxation authority back towards the legislative branch. However, what happened next is just as important as the ruling itself. Within hours, a new 10% global tariff was announced, presumably under a different statutory mechanism. That immediate response tells you something. This is not about retreating from tariff policy. It's about contesting who gets to control it. And that subtle distinction is where the market implications begin. Tariffs are not abstract political tools, they are economic levers. When tariffs are introduced, import prices can rise. Companies must either absorb those costs, pass them on to consumers, or restructure supply chains. Each of those outcomes feeds directly into inflation dynamics. And right now, inflation remains the most sensitive variable in the global financial system. Central banks have spent the past 2 years fighting inflation aggressively. The Federal Reserve tightened monetary policy at one of the fastest paces in decades. Liquidity drained from the system, bond yields rose, risk assets repriced. Crypto was not immune to that tightening cycle. So when trade friction re-enters the conversation, markets immediately begin recalculating inflation expectations. Even a modest global tariff can influence expectations at the margin. If markets begin to believe that protectionism is structurally returning, then forward inflation assumptions shift. And when forward inflation assumptions shift, bond yields respond. Rising yields increase borrowing costs across the economy. Higher borrowing costs compress equity valuations. When valuations compress, risk appetite contracts. This is the transmission mechanism. It is mechanical, not emotional. At the same time, there is a second order effect that is less obvious but equally important. When executive authority becomes legally constrained, but geopolitical tensions remain high, particularly with China, trade disputes do not disappear. Instead, they become more politically negotiated and potentially more uncertain. Slower decision making can introduce prolonged ambiguity. Markets can price bad news. They struggle to price prolonged uncertainty. Uncertainty increases volatility. Volatility changes capital flows. And capital flows are what drive asset prices, including crypto. Now, here's where the nuance matters. In the immediate aftermath of tariff escalation, the US dollar often strengthens. Higher inflation expectations can push yields higher. Higher yields support dollar strength. A strong dollar historically tightens global liquidity conditions, especially for emerging markets. When global liquidity tightens, crypto typically behaves like a high beta risk asset and experiences pressure rather than acting as a safe haven. However, beyond the immediate liquidity reaction, there is a structural layer to consider. The more trade becomes politicised, the more monetary sovereignty becomes weaponised, and the more cross-border systems become contested, the greater the demand for neutral financial rails. Stablecoins, decentralised settlement networks, and digital asset infrastructure all sit at that intersection. As global trade fragments into blocks, alternative rails become strategically valuable. We also need to consider the next election contest. This ruling lands during a politically charged cycle. Trade rhetoric tends to intensify in election years. Economic nationalism often resonates during periods of uncertainty. That means we may see further boundary testing of statutory authority, further court involvement, and further headline volatility. Markets will be forced to interpret each development in real time. So what does that mean practically? It means the next few months could be less defined by clean macro trends and more episodic volatility. Bond yields will be the first signal to watch. If yields spike materially on tariff-driven inflation fears, risk assets could retrace. If yields remain contained, markets may interpret the move as politically symbolic rather than structurally inflationary. The US dollar will be the second signal. Sustained dollar strength pressures global liquidity and crypto. Dollar weakness, by contrast, tends to support risk assets. So the real takeaway from this Supreme Court ruling is not that tariffs are gone or that trade wars are over. It's that executive power over trade taxation has been legally narrowed, and the immediate political response suggests that the debate over tax authority is far from settled. That institutional friction introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty introduces volatility. Volatility reshapes capital flows. And crypto, as always, sits at the edge of those capital flows. If you found this breakdown useful, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to check out the UK Crypto Podcast every Friday at 7 p.m. with me and Milkshake Matty if you want even more of these conversations in a slightly looser format. Let me know in the comments how you're reading this. Is this a healthy constitutional guardrail or the beginning of a more volatile trade cycle? Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.